All rise, veuillez vous lever. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Good afternoon. I think Mr. Suzuki wants the floor, and if so, he gets the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good afternoon. Good afternoon, Your Honours. This afternoon I propose to continue where counsel left off, and I'd like to point out the evidentiary deficiencies in the prosecution brief. And I'll focus primarily on the PK9 Mbaiki access charges. And I propose to do so while expounding on a particular theme that Your Honours will be familiar with from our closing brief. And that is the nebulousness of the term antibalaka and the impact of this on the prosecution case. And I'd like to start by taking two illustrative examples from the evidence that is before Your Honours. First of all, a very short clip from a documentary filmed in CAR during the events. And for the interpreters, that's Caro TP 2130-1332 at page 1336, lines 87 to 89, which my colleague will now play.
Church.
Bienvenue chez nous en République centrafricaine, dont les Balaka, ce sont les fils du pays. Tu ne peux pas les connaître. Je peux être un Balaka, lui il peut être un Balaka, la femme peut être un Balaka, mais on ne peut pas les connaître.
And secondly, Your Honor, some testimonial evidence from prosecution witness Hassan Issa, P1676, a Muslim civilian and the deputy imam of the Ali Babala Mosque in Bangui. And in his statement, Mr. Issa recounted an incident where a group of Muslims and Red Cross personnel were traveling through Bangui on the 7th of December. And they encountered a group of what he described as overexcited young Christians, some armed with machetes and others with guns, insulting Muslims. And in his interview, he stated, as you can see on your screen, "I don't know if they were anti-Balaka because I wasn't able to distinguish them." And he recounted another incident whereby a convoy that he was traveling in was nearly attacked by what he described as a group of anti-Balaka in combatants, carrying machetes and sticks. And as you see on your screens in his statement, it is subsequently written, "For me, from the moment these overexcited youths take up machetes and batons, they are anti-Balaka." And these extracts reflect another closely related theme of my submissions today, Your Honours, and that's the role of mass violence in the car crisis. The fact that in this period, people rising up as individuals or as groups, formal, informal, and they were angry and hostile, and they were committing violence against the Muslim population of CAR. And Mr. Issa's evidence in particular neatly illustrates the way that these two themes interplay in our submission, because it illustrates the manner in which the term anti-Balaka could be applied, and demonstrably was applied, to anyone who picked up a machete amidst the wave of popular violence that swept over CAR in 2013 and 2014. Now, the prosecution in its pretrial brief had defined the anti-Balaka as any subgroup or plurality of members or elements thereof, whether or not formally organized or constituted. And at first glance, this definition appears to encapsulate the nebulousness of the term. So you could be forgiven for thinking that the prosecution recognizes this dual reality, both of the term and of the role of mass violence during the events. But by now, Your Honours, I submit that it's clear that the recognition is purely superficial. And the prosecution case on the PK9 Mbaiki charges as investigated and prosecuted, either ignores this dual reality and fails to meaningfully accommodate it, or it actually exploits it and seeks to use it to its advantage. And I propose to demonstrate that with some examples today. Now, after having introduced that, I actually have to briefly diverge from the main theme of my submissions, Your Honor. I need to make two very brief points on the Katan charges. First of all, contrary to what prosecution counsel said earlier this week, it was not P1528's evidence that he heard the sounds of a man being beaten to death. And we'll refer, Your Honors, to the transcript of his evidence as to what he actually heard, what he specifically heard, and to the defense submissions on this point in our brief. And secondly, again on the alleged killing in Katan, the prosecution relies on an interview that was conducted by the United Nations Commission of Inquiry. It was an interview with an anonymous individual regarding, quote, the killing of his 22-year-old son, a Muslim civilian, by anti-Balaka in Katan during the 5 December attack. And that's paragraph 567 and 569 of the prosecution brief. And at the outset, Your Honor, this is a mischaracterization. The interview does not state that the individual was killed during the 5 December attack. And Your Honors have before you on the screen the document the prosecution relies on is on the left, and the document on the right is also a UNCOI interview. And the document on the right was tendered from the bar table by the prosecution. And Your Honors rejected it on the basis that it was testimonial evidence, and that's filing 2182. And as you can see, the document on the left, again, relied on by the prosecution, is a verbatim copy of the document on the right. And in filing 1947, the prosecution had previously argued that the document on the left was not testimonial evidence. So you'll imagine our surprise, Your Honors, to see that the prosecution has now repurposed this document and argues in its final brief that this document comprises, quote, credible testimony. That's paragraph 569. Now, our position is that this document can't be relied upon at all, and we refer Your Honors to our submissions at paragraph 59 of defense filing 1978. I'm going to address the prosecution allegations on the PK9 bikie access charges now, Your Honors. Again, with the particular focus on these two themes of my submissions today. And I'd like to demonstrate how the prosecution had ignored or actively exploited these two factors by seeking to attribute to Mr. Yekatom and the RFA-CPP acts and incidents of individuals falling under this term anti-Balaka, despite their being unrelated or unassociated to him or the RFA-CPP. And first of all, the prosecution allegation at paragraph 706 of its brief, which was discussed yesterday by prosecution counsel, and that is that armed elements from Mr. Yekatom's group regulated movement, targeting Muslims at roadblocks and preventing their circulation. And in support of this allegation, the prosecution cites D295015, who testified about his efforts to evacuate a Muslim man and to transport him to Mbaiki by vehicle, and about the need to take precautions because of the risk of being stopped and searched at checkpoints. But as you can see, Your Honors, from the extract of his testimony in front of you, D295015 was not referring to RFA-CPP checkpoints. He was concerned about spontaneous, improvised checkpoints, which he had previously discussed in his evidence in the extract on the right, where he says, a village which never had a checkpoint, you would arrive, and suddenly you'd find they had put one up. That's the way it was. It was done on the initiative of the villagers. And we also refer, Your Honors, to prosecution witness an RFA-CPP member P1647, who testified about checkpoints on that same axis, the Mbaiki-Boda axis, that were manned by individuals who were not part of the RFA-CPP. And that's transcript 196. And more broadly, Your Honors, we refer you to paragraph 486 of the defense brief, and especially the evidence of D295013 on the matter of checkpoints along the axis. And we submit that this evidence should be kept in mind when Your Honors assess the prosecution's repeated assertions in its brief that Mr. Yekatom or the RFA-CPP controlled the axis, or when they use phrases like their zone of control. Because despite these assertions, the prosecution fails to explain to Your Honors what control of the axis would entail in practice, especially in the midst of this mass popular uprising and the emergence of local independent self-defense groups along the axis. The prosecution relies on another document in support of this allegation, and it was received from the French authorities in 2018. And it comprises Sangaris reports in various localities, including Baiki. And you see it, you see page 376 on the screen in front of you, Jonas. And you'll see that it refers to relatively large groupings of anti-Balaka having been observed manning checkpoints at the entry and exits of Mbaiki, aimed at stopping all movement of Muslims on the 29th of January 2014. That is the day of the Seleka withdrawal. But I'd also like to draw Your Honor's attention to the entry for 1 February 2014 on the right of your screen in the middle. And it says in French, and I quote, La journée a été marquée par l'arrivée d'éléments du caporal-chef Rambo dans Mbaiki. And the entry goes on to state that these elements established themselves at the Socatel building. In other words, the Sangaris report appears to distinguish between, on the one hand, the anti-Balaka that it observes at the entry and exits of Mbaiki on the 29th of January, and on the other hand, the arrival of elements it expressly associates with the RFA-CPP, or rather with Mr. Yekatom, who based themselves at Socatel on the 1st of February. And in this respect, Your Honors will recall the evidence of P1839, who stated that the 30 January 2014 church meeting was the first time the group arrived in Baiki. And that's transcript 174. And also the evidence of P1786 and the evidence of P1647, both of whom confirmed that RFA-CPP elements arrived in Baiki after the departure of the Seleka and established themselves at Socatel. Now, I'd also like to draw your attention to the entry for 31 January, also on the right of the screen, but above. And the entry for 31 January reports that on the day, around 50 ex-FACA, equipped with AK-47s and PKMs, arrived in Baiki aboard 3 pickup trucks. And now, Your Honors have heard evidence about a FACA lieutenant named Julius Guga Imbi. And he was the commzone of the Damala anti-Balaka base in the north of Bangui. And on the evidence, in this capacity, he commanded a few hundred ex-FACA and civilians. And on the evidence, commzone Guga traveled to Mbaiki in this period, along with anti-Balaka, in 3 pickup trucks. And that's paragraph 87 of his witness statement. Now, as Your Honors are aware, the prosecution case on counts 24 and 25 is very much premised on the idea that reference in the evidence to anti-Balaka and Mbaiki should automatically be attributed to Mr. Yekatom or to the RFA-CPP. And it's on this basis that the prosecution seeks to attribute responsibility for the conduct of the anti-Balaka in Mbaiki to Mr. Yekatom. And so we would submit that the arrival of 3 pickup trucks full of anti-balaka, along with the anti-balaka com zone of Damala, in Mbaiki is something that impacts the prosecution case. And that's very simply because the prosecution has failed to link these anti-balaka with Mr. Yekatom or the RFA-CPP. And especially given that the Sangaris report, again, appears to distinguish between the arrival of elements associated with Mr. Yekatom on the 1st of February and the arrival of these 3 pickups of ex-Faka in Mbaiki on the 31st of January. And the prosecution has opted to simply ignore this event, not just in its brief, but also at trial. Because as your honors know, there is a prosecution witness who is very well placed to clear up any ambiguities about this, about the arrival and the provenance of these 3 pickup trucks of anti-balaka. And yet at no point did the prosecution seek clarification of this incident, of this issue, when he appeared and testified, despite the fact that this was a prosecution witness, and despite the fact that this issue arises entirely out of prosecution evidence. And the prosecution's treatment of this issue takes me to a different matter, Your Honors. And that's an incident, or an alleged incident, that's relied on in the prosecution brief and extracted in front of Your Honors. And it was also raised by prosecution counsel yesterday. And Your Honors heard earlier Maître Guisset refer to the Celebici principle in respect of evidentiary assessment. And I'd like to examine this incident with that principle in mind. Now, on the evidence, in respect of this incident, RFA-CPP elements were in a twin-cab pickup truck. And from the back seat of that pickup truck, an RFA-CPP element gestured to a group of Muslims on the side of the road and made a threatening remark to a person or to people in that group. And Mr. Yekatom was alleged to have been sitting in the front seat of that pickup truck. And according to the evidence, he did not react to the element's gesture and this remark. And I'd like to focus on the prosecution's treatment of this incident because you heard Counsel Dimitri earlier refer to the prosecution's tendency to operate in these evidentiary gray areas and its tendency to avoid squarely confronting its own ambiguous evidence and to properly clarify its probative value, and by extension, its failure to assist your honors to determine the truth. Now, first of all, the fact that on the evidence the element was sitting directly behind Mr. Yekatom obviously has implications as to whether Mr. Yekatom was even in a position to see him make that gesture in the first place. And secondly, in respect of the remark that was allegedly made, in our submission, it can't be controversial to suggest that a remark made by someone in the back of a moving pickup truck would not necessarily be audible or comprehensible to someone sitting in the front of that pickup truck. Any number of factors would affect that determination. And given the importance that the prosecution places on this incident, it argues that the incident shows that Mr. Yekatom did not care if RFA-CPP elements threatened Muslims. And it shows that he did not actually seek reconciliation and peace. And we would submit, therefore, Your Honors, that it was incumbent on the prosecution to elicit clarifying information that would allow Your Honors to safely determine whether Mr. Yekatom would have heard or seen the element make that gesture. And information as to whether he would have seen, or rather heard, the element say what he's alleged to have said. How loudly was the remark made, for one? What was Mr. Yekatom doing at the moment? What was happening in the car at the time? Also, what was happening outside the truck? Because Your Honours received evidence about the manner in which inhabitants of Mbaiki celebrated the arrival of RFA-CPP elements in Mbaiki by surrounding their vehicles, singing, dancing, and shouting. And in fact, Your Honours have video evidence of this manner of celebrating their arrival of the RFA-CPP in Pisa in particular. And that's transcript 174, pages 31 and 62. And yet no such clarifying information was sought by the OTP from its own witness. And we would submit that the inference is available to Your Honours that the prosecution avoided asking these questions and avoided clarifying this ambiguity precisely because the prosecution was afraid of the risk that the answers would not assist its case. Because in this regard, Your Honours, we have, or rather, Your Honours have, evidence in front of you about the way that Mr. Yekatom did, in fact, react when he heard RFA-CPP elements insulting Muslims. Because prosecution evidence indicates that when the Muslim convoys were passing through PK9 on their way to Bangui, and according to a witness, the Muslims in the convoy and the RFA-CPP elements started to exchange threats, or rather insults, Mr. Yekatom said to the elements, "We mustn't insult them." And that's transcript 171. I'm going to move on to the prosecution allegation, Your Honours, that Mr. Yekatom's elements threatened Muslims in Mbaiki, which you also heard prosecution counsel discuss yesterday. Now, prosecution counsel cited the evidence of P2353 regarding threats made to Muslims in Mbaiki. And indeed, the prosecution gives particular attention to this witness, or to his evidence in their brief. They cite it verbatim in the body of their brief, including his assertion that, quote, "the elements who were issuing threats were Rambo's elements." Now, what the prosecution omits from this verbatim quote was his sentence that followed, which states, quote, "I know this because Rambo stated at the church that he was in charge of the Antibalaka." It's paragraph 53 of his statement. Now, as Your Honours are aware, P2353 was not at the church meeting. And the chamber has received evidence that Mr. Yekatom did not introduce himself as an Antibalaka, but as a Faka at that meeting. But the point that I'd like to focus on is how this extract demonstrates that P2353's assertion, attributing the source of these threats to, quote, Rambo's elements, is in fact the product of unsafe, conclusory reasoning. Because obviously, even if Mr. Yekatom had said that he was in charge of the Antibalaka, it does not follow that the Antibalaka that P2353 saw threatening Muslims in Mbaiki were RFA-CPP elements. And more broadly, throughout our brief, we address this tendency prevalent among prosecution witnesses to make assertions that are demonstrably the product of this kind of unsafe conclusory reasoning. And P2353's conclusory reasoning takes on extra significance here because it reflects the broader themes of my submissions. Because P2353 actually specifically testified that harassment of Muslims in Mbaiki by the Antibalaka had been ongoing well before the killing of the Imam of Bagandu. And in fact, he states that this killing only increased his fear. That's transcript 161. And on the evidence, the killing of the Imam of Bagandu took place on the 25th of January. And the RFA-CPP had not yet reached Mbaiki by that date. In fact, they hadn't even reached Pisa. And so the evidence, his evidence, should be understood as retroactively attributing the anti-Balaka who made these threats to Mr. Yekatom. And his evidence about anti-Balaka harassing Muslims in Mbaiki before the RFA-CPP can't just be dismissed as an anomaly or an unreliable temporal recollection, because he's corroborated in this regard by multiple prosecution and defense witnesses. And in fact, as we set out in our brief, it was because of the real risk of inter-community violence that was perceived on the ground by Mbaiki's local authorities, its religious authorities, and humanitarian personnel. That was the very reason that Mr. Yekatom was asked to come to Mbaiki in the first place. And we refer, Your Honors, to 516-520 of our defense brief. And in particular, Your Honors, I note the evidence of the then prefect of Lobai, P. 1813, who stated that at the time of the PISA meeting with Mr. Yekatom, and I quote in French, "La tension était très tendue. Les anti-Balaka devenaient de plus en plus nombreux à cause des personnes qui s'étaient improvisées anti-Balaka." And that's transcript 182. And as Your Honors are aware, the PISA meeting took place a few days before the Mbaiki church meeting, and it took place while the Seleka was still present in Mbaiki. And we also refer, Your Honors, to the evidence of P1595, whose evidence also suggests the presence of anti-Balaka threatening Muslims in Mbaiki sometime in mid-January. And we note P1595's own definition of anti-Balaka, which mirrors that of the deputy imam of the Ali Babola Mosque. And that is, quote, "According to me, the anti-Balaka are the armed people." And we also refer, Your Honors, to P1666, who referred to anti-Balaka wielding machetes, walking around Mbaiki and threatening Muslims. And he specifically stated that the Mbaiki church meeting took place after the arrival of these anti-Balaka. And that's transcript 230. And P166 was another witness that was referred to by prosecution counsel yesterday, and whose allegations about anti-Balaka threats the prosecution seeks to rely on against Mr. Yekatom. And as cited by prosecution counsel yesterday, and this is also in the prosecution brief, P166 stated that the Muslims were afraid of the anti-Balaka who had come in and might assault them at any time. They were not afraid of the local people. And we submit, Your Honors, that the prosecution's reliance on this evidence against Mr. Yekatom is misplaced for two reasons. First, because as I just referred to, he referred to machete-wielding anti-Balaka in Mbaiki before the church meeting. And in this regard, he also referred to the fact that there was tension in the city of Mbaiki well before the meeting. And he says, in the extract in the screen in front of Your Honors, "Les populations de la ville voulaient coûte que coûte en découdre avec les musulmans." And secondly, Your Honors will recall his testimony about the fact that during this meeting, a large and hostile crowd had gathered outside the church, and they were vocally threatening the Muslims inside. And P166 stated, quote, "On a commencé à entendre les gens de dehors dire que non, le moment est venu. Il faut commencer à attaquer les leaders musulmans ici." And as you can see in the slide in front of you, this same witness referred to the fact that Christians from neighboring areas had been present in Mbaiki and were among the crowd. And so the suggestion that P166 reference to the anti-Balaka who had come in and might assault them at any time should be understood as reference to the RFA-CPP element specifically is misguided. I'm going to proceed to my final subject, Your Honors, on the PK9 Mbaiki axis, And that's two arguments that the prosecution has made about the role of civilian violence in their brief. And that's paragraphs 718 and 719. And I propose to address them each in turn. First of all, Your Honor, the prosecution attempts to dismiss the role of civilians by claiming that, quote, many of them were integrated into Yekatom's group on their arrival and thus formed a part of it. And in support of this allegation, the prosecution cites, again, P1666, who was asked how many anti-Balaka were present in Mbaiki by the time Mbaiki was evacuated of its Muslims. And he responded almost 1,000, citing the young people from the locality who had joined their ranks. And this evidence, Your Honor, we'd submit that it's revealing, and it shows the inadequacy of this prosecution attempt to gloss over the role of mass civilian violence in Mbaiki at the time. And that's because Your Honor's received evidence from prosecution insider witness P1647, the deputy commzone of Mbaiki, who said that there were between 30 and 90 elements under their command in Mbaiki. And you'll also recall prosecution counsel referring to insider witnesses earlier this week, and he said, they are the ones who were there. They are the ones who absolutely know what the anti-Balaka did. And in respect of P1647's evidence, on this particular point, we have to agree with prosecution counsel. And when the question was put to Abbot Antares, D295012, as to whether at any point there were 1,000 RFSCPP members in Mbaiki, he said, and I quote in French, 1000 hommes, non, ça fait beaucoup quand même. And we also refer, Your Honors, to the evidence of the Lobai prefect. Again, I quote in French, c'est vrai, les quelques rares anti-Balaka qui étaient proches de l'accusé ici étaient dans la ville. Mais beaucoup de jeunes étaient intéressés à la chose, c'était improvisé anti-Balaka. And lastly, on this point, I'd like to return to the matter of the crowd that was gathered outside the church. And in fact, you want to have a photograph of that moment or that crowd. And I'd like to recall the evidence of D295013, who explained what Mr. Yekatom had said to this crowd of agitated, hostile youths that had gathered outside the church waiting for Mr. Yekatom's green light to unleash violence upon the Muslims of Mbaiki. And she said, and I quote, she said that he said, rather, vous êtes trop jeune. Votre place n'est pas ici. Votre place est soit au champ pour aider vos parents à travailler la terre, soit à l'école. Mais avec moi, c'est un travail de professionnel. Ce n'est pas votre place. And that's transcript 285. And so the prosecution paints a picture of the facts on the ground in Mbaiki that distorts the reality, Your Honors, about the role of civilian violence in this period. And the evidence of D295013 in this regard is also relevant to the prosecution's second argument on this matter. And that is that the arrival of Mr. Yekatom and the RFA-CPP created an environment that facilitated and encouraged the targeting of the Muslim population. And a number of witnesses have given evidence about this hostile crowd that gathered outside the church and at the bus station. And on the evidence, Mr. Yekatom warned these ill-intentioned civilians, much to their disappointment, that the RFA-CPP was not in Mbaiki to harm the Muslims, and that if any Christian were to harm a Muslim, he would kill them. And I'll return to the evidence of P1666 on the screen in front of you. A Muslim representative of the community in Mbaiki. And he says, in French, si jamais il n'avait pas tenu ce propos, certainement ça allait dégénérer en un conflit difficile. And we submit, Your Honors, that the prosecution argument that Mr. Yekatom's arrival facilitated and encouraged the targeting of Muslims by Christian civilians is massively undermined by the fact that Mr. Yekatom issued this public warning to the people of Mbaiki. And in that respect, it's little wonder that the prosecution has sought simply to ignore these particular speeches as if they never took place. All the evidence from Mbaiki Muslims, also prosecution witnesses, that Mr. Yekatom and Freddie Wanjo provided their contact details to Muslims in Mbaiki and urged them to contact them if ever Muslims were harassed or threatened. Or indeed, Your Honours, the evidence of multiple prosecution and defense witnesses, local authorities, Muslim, Christian religious authorities, Muslim community leaders, and humanitarian personnel who testified about the positive impact of Mr. Yekatom's presence in Mbaiki on peace and security that we detail in our brief. And no, nobody did vote for Mr. Yekatom, but they did ask Mr. Yekatom. These authorities and humanitarian personnel asked Mr. Yekatom to come to the church meeting to address the population in the hope of easing community tensions, and they asked him to stay in Mbaiki to help ensure that the Muslims who had gathered in Mbaiki, whose departure had already been decided, would not be victims of the inter-community violence that was ravaging the country. And Mr. Yekatom complied. And all of these witnesses, defense witnesses and prosecution witnesses, all of these witnesses were willing to come before Your Honours and give Mr. Yekatom credit where it's due. Nothing more and nothing less. And the fact that the prosecution has not been able to acknowledge this evidence, let alone accommodate it in its case theory, we would submit is a very good indication of the fragility of their case against Mr. Yekatom. Now, just to conclude, Your Honours, my submissions can be boiled down to this. We respectfully request that when Your Honours are assessing the evidence before you, and you encounter reference to conduct of the anti-Balaka, or even phrases like Mr. Yekatom's anti-Balaka, or Freddie Wanjo's anti-Balaka, that Your Honours keep both the nebulousness of this term and the role of the civilians in the violence during the car crisis, that Your Honours keep this at the forefront of your minds, and that you closely examine the foundation for these assertions. And we would submit that if Your Honours do, then the extent to which the prosecution case on these counts glosses over the ambiguities in the evidence and unsafely seeks to attribute responsibility for the conduct of anyone and everyone who can claim to be an anti-Balaka, who is labeled as anti-Balaka, to the RFA-CPP and to Mr. Yekatom, that this will be clear to Your Honours. And now I'll give the floor to my colleague, Ms. Bafeda. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Suzuki.
Good afternoon, Your Honours. as forecast, I will be dealing with and addressing the individual criminal responsibility of Mr. Yekatom. I know that we heard Ms. Gisay say that I will also be dealing with legal characterization, but actually, having heard the general submissions of the prosecution on Monday and Tuesday, and having read their broad arguments in their brief, it is our position that our submissions on the legal characterization of the facts remains unchanged. And so I will merely refer your honours to the relevant sections of our brief, and that's sections 4A and 5C, instead of rehashing it today. Instead, your honours, what I intend to do today and this afternoon is to focus on the three broad themes that were emphasised in the prosecution's closing and in particular on Monday, both in terms of the evidence led and the implications of what it is that the prosecution asks of you when it comes to Mr. Yekatom's individual criminal responsibility. And so really, just to reset your honours, there are three broad themes that were emphasised, this being the anti-Muslim animus, the depiction of Mr. Yekatom as a hierarchical warlord, in as much as it goes to the common plan and the essential contributions, and his mens rea, that is, the prosecution's fallback position that Mr. Yekatom must have known in the ordinary course of events that the alleged commission of crimes would have occurred. But, Your Honours, I'll start with this anti-Muslim animus, and with your indulgence, I'll be referring it to animus to save myself some time. This notion, or this sentiment of animus, as you can see on the slide, really props up each component of the prosecution's case against Mr. Yekatom, and these components can be seen on the slide. And in particular, we see that the requirement to prove this animus beyond a reasonable doubt is to establish the various spokes, that being the criminal policy, the common plan, as well as the various components of the essential contribution. And yet, despite its efforts, as I will get to, we submit that the prosecution has not demonstrated that Mr. Yekatom has an iota of animus against or towards the Muslims. And the result of this naturally means each of these spokes falls, and the case against Mr. Yekatom is just not met. And so I will turn now to the lack of evidence of this animus. And, Your Honours, really, my point is a simple one. Given the significance of the animus to the prosecution's case, and this was a deliberate choice to make it front and centre, you would expect that the case itself was formulated around strong and overwhelming evidence. Particularly, as we heard on Monday, that it is the prosecution's position that Mr. Yekatom is someone fueled by vengeance and motivated by a violent anti-Muslim animus. Surely then, amongst the 16,000 items submitted by the prosecution, amongst the hundreds of hours of video and audio footage that you have before you, Your Honours, you can imagine that surely there must be a plethora of items then, a plethora of evidence for the prosecution to present before you. And that when it came to Monday, we would be hearing an abundance of evidence that the prosecution would have available to it at its fingertips to show this crucial point of their case, this animus. Perhaps we would have expected to see videos which captured Mr. Yekatom describing his apparent hatred of Muslims. Maybe even speeches rallying the elements against them to target Muslim civilians. After all, you will recall that on Monday we were told that Mr. Yekatom and the RFA-CPP held no shame in repeating this apparent animus in public for all the world to see. So what is this evidence? What is this overwhelming evidence that they have to prove the animus against Mr. Yekatom? It's a fair question, Your Honour, given that we neither heard nor saw such evidence during the prosecution's closing arguments on Monday or Tuesday. And it was this absence of direct evidence, I will argue, that goes directly to the animus hub that was striking towards the end of the close of the prosecution's argument. The prosecution does have, Your Honour, and you see on the slide, paragraph 452. It does direct you in its brief to a video, which you will recall has Mr. Yekatom stating, and I'll quote, that in our army there are not even Chadians, there is not a man Musa, there is not a man Adam. That's it. That is all the prosecution provides you with in terms of so-called direct evidence of Mr. Yekatom's animus. There is no violent anti-Muslim rhetoric, which would substantiate the exaggerated claims that we heard on Monday or set out in the prosecution's brief. There is nothing to support the alleged vengeful nature, and there is not a single utterance that Mr. Yekatom considered the Muslims to be his enemy, let alone the enemy. What I want to do, Your Honours, is take this video in context. And when you do so, it becomes apparent that Mr. Yekatom isn't even talking about Muslims. He's speaking of Seleka, and not even in general terms. So let me put it in context, Your Honour. Your Honours. This video was captured on the 7th of December 2013. That is when Seleka was still in power and in charge of the Car National Army, having disbanded the FACA soon after its takeover of Bangui. The army, which the prosecution puts in quotation marks at paragraph 452 of its brief, concerns the FACA and the fact that it was not made of foreign nationals. Again, this was in contrast to December 2013. The Musa and Adam spoken of, Your Honours, are in reference to two notorious and high-ranking Seleka generals in the Car National Army. And you see that we've depicted this on the slide. To the left is Musa Asima, who's well known to have strong ties with the Sudanese Janjaweed. And then on the right, Nuruddin Adam, who the Office of the Prosecutor as a whole alleges wielded more power than Jatodia and was known to have strong Chadian links. It's not quite the smoking gun evidence which would support the hyperbole set out by the prosecution on Monday. So what is the evidential basis then? Again, we have to ask this question that the prosecution wants you to find Mr. Yekatom guilty of. How is it trying to establish this key component of its case? And it's not as if, Your Honours, that this was a situation for lack of opportunity. The crisis took place when social media was prevalent, when we know that journalists were running around on the grounds with their cameras. How is it not that one journalist caught him on camera uttering the words of this animus, uttering his hatred for Muslims? Perhaps he never said it. And so what the prosecution does, and this is on my next point, in order to paper over this crack, Your Honours, is it asks you to instead infer, instead of looking at his actual words and his actual conduct, it asks you to infer the animus from the words of others. It's trying to attribute the words of other individuals and literally put their words into his mouth. And so there are three main points that I will deal with here. The first, and I've set out some examples from the prosecution brief of paragraphs 140, 169, 174, and 182, is for the prosecution extensively relies on the rhetoric of unknown individuals and persons to attribute to the same animus to Mr. Yekatom. These are individuals, as we've heard Mr. Suzuki just mention, with no demonstrable link to Mr. Yekatom. And I want to flag here in particular one paragraph, paragraph 451 at the next slide, if my colleague can take that. And I just, to emphasize, this is not an isolated example, and it's done for the purpose of this hearing alone. But here, you'll see the prosecution asserts that Yekatom's elements, and I'm quoting here, also express the same anti-Muslim animus. As already set out, Your Honours, the use of the word same here is rather misleading when the prosecution is wanting to infer Mr. Yekatom's animus from the acts and words of others. This would presume a starting point, of course, that in the first place they had established that Mr. Yekatom had uttered the animus himself. No such basis has been set out. But I'll direct you to the right-hand side and that's car OTP 2065-002. And you'll recall that this video in particular was played in court on Monday. And it was presented as a video, and I'm quoting again, that demonstrated the alleged anti-Muslim animus policy, with counsel stating that the video depicted Rodrigue Momokoma, who was described as Mr. Yekatom's right-hand man. The video, and again I'm not replaying it, was played from the first minute, and I'm sure it will not have escaped Your Honour's attention that in the 45-second clip played in court, Momokoma was nowhere to be seen. We didn't stop any clip, we didn't see him appear. And that's because when you view the entire footage, Your Honours, in the very first 7 seconds of that clip, what we see is Momokoma literally walking away from the group that ends up spouting the anti-Muslim rhetoric that was played by the prosecution in court. This was, of course, we say, intentionally glossed over by the prosecution for dramatic license. That's not quite how one should be dealing with the evidence, however. Apparently, for the prosecution, it's sufficient that Momokoma would have been in the vicinity of persons who then subsequently spoke of their hatred towards Muslims, to then, to the third degree, try and attribute that to Mr. Yekatom. And then this is not further compounded, because it then makes it a central part of its case. This is all that the prosecution's case is built on. It's really a case of desperate times when the evidence doesn't show you or present with what you want to call for desperate measures. That is, to overstretch the evidence to a point where it becomes unreasonable. The second point with regard to the inference of anti-Muslim animus is that the prosecution continues to take video footage, again, out of context, and Ms. Dimitri has already fleshed this out this morning. And really here, it's the same tactic, the same modus operandi when we come to look at the animus. And again, I don't intend to show the video again because Your Honours will have seen it. And if I can use the shorthand, you will recall the Habib Bainer genocide video. Again, they make this a central part of their case. We were told that it spoke volumes of the murderous intention of Mr. Yekatom. This single video, Your Honours, is not even categorical of Bainer's murderous intentions, let alone Mr. Yekatom's. If you take the video in context, when you look at the actual words that Bainer was using, he speaks of the Seleka, he speaks of the Janjaweed, he speaks of the Sudanese, he speaks of the Chadians. He does not speak of the Muslims. And this is not a case that was dealt with by Ms. Dimitri this morning, where the use of the word Muslim was meant to intend Seleka. This is quite literally Bainer using the word Seleka in the context of other foreign entities. When Bainer says Seleka, he means the Seleka. And that's not my word, Your Honours. This is the word of two insider witnesses, or two witnesses called by the prosecution, who contextualise the speech in reference to political interferences in Car. Neither witness ascribed to the prosecution's inference that Bainer would have been discussing the commission of genocide against Muslims. In contextualising the video, Your Honours, it also matches the evidence before you of Bainer's provision of assistance and protection of Muslims in Car during the charged period. And I'm not going to go into this, but this is set out in paragraphs 236, 324, and 331 of our brief. But all I will ask and put out right now is that this man, Bainer, who is apparently so intent on committing genocide, not weeks later, is then assisting the very same Muslims, and yet we are being asked to use his words to attribute and to accuse Mr. Yekatom of holding the very same murderous intentions. It just does not add up. And then the third point, Your Honour, on this inference aspect is that the prosecution has not led any evidence that would show that Mr. Yekatom was physically present in any of the videos where such animus is depicted, that is quite literally standing there as someone else is spouting the hatred for Muslims. You will recall that we were told that Mr. Yekatom promoted and encouraged this animus. But where is the evidence of this? Where is the evidence that he promoted, that he stood by while others spoke of such animus? Again, Your Honours, it's nowhere to be seen, despite the fact that this is front and centre in the prosecution's case. And I refer here to the prosecution's repeated use of the video in which you saw, again, I'm not going to replay on Monday, the video of Max Maidanda, and that's CAR OTP 2065-3188. And Your Honours will recall the attempt on Monday to link this item with yet another video that shows Mr. Yekatom would have been sat next to Maidanda after he was filmed using anti-Muslim rhetoric. The inference being then, of course, that Mr. Yekatom would have heard Max Maidanda. But there's no proof of that, Your Honours. There's no proof that Mr. Yekatom knew that Max Maidanda harboured such sentiments. And this is not just speculation, but it's also supported by the fact of from evidence of other prosecution insider witnesses, including P 1839, P 1674, and P 1786. Each of them, when confronted with the same video, had no clue that Max Maidanda harboured or expressed this sentiment, and showed genuine shock when they were shown it. We have also heard evidence, including from P 1839, that the RFA-CPP members were not always transparent with Mr. Yekatom. Their acts were often conducted without his knowledge and behind his back. In this context, then, when the prosecution is asking you to piecemeal a series of videos to infer animus to Mr. Yekatom, it is insufficient. It is insufficient to attribute such a policy, such a sentiment to Mr. Yekatom. And in particular, it lacks any real value and does not amount to the exaggerated terms. And I want you, Your Honours, to really remember the vengeful nature, the use of the words used by the prosecution to try and portray and depict Mr. Yekatom as someone that held such hatred for Muslims. If I'll move now on to the second general theme that was presented to us on Monday and to Your Honours on Monday and Tuesday, and that's being the common plan and essential contribution, and this portrayal of Mr. Yekatom as his hierarchical warlord. It's quickly become a recurring theme, and we've each touched on it today in our closing, that in its brief and in its closing, the prosecution repeatedly recycles the same narrow set of facts to support a circular argument. In this case, in relation to Mr. Yekatom's individual criminal responsibility, the circular argument is, 1, that Mr. Yekatom held an anti-Muslim animus, 2, that this animus is why he entered into the common plan, 3, that he provided an essential contribution to the common plan to further the alleged animus, and that 4, that this animus is proven by the very existence of the common plan and his essential contribution to it. It is a roundabout argument. And we are reasonable, Your Honours. We understand that these cases, often, there is a natural overlap, of course there is, between facts which underpin the common plan and facts which underpin the essential contributions. However, it becomes problematic when circular arguments are used to substitute for actual evidence and actual facts, or as a means to distract from their absence. This reasoning is not only circular, but it's also self-fulfilling. Your Honours are essentially being asked to presume the very conclusion that they seek to prove. And so it's insufficient. I don't have enough time to go through each of the essential contributions. And in any case, this is all set out in our final brief. But I will focus on key mischaracterization in the prosecution's closing concerning the alleged structuring of the RFA CPP, which neatly demonstrates the prosecution's cognitive disengagement from the evidence and which served to break these circular arguments that I referred to and that were mentioned to us and presented in this court on Monday. So structuring. This is the first limb of the charged essential contributions against Mr. Yekatom. And during its closing, the prosecution developed what I can only describe as a mantra. It repeatedly described in absolute terms, there wasn't any qualification, in absolute terms, they described Mr. Yekatom as holding undisputed power, stating over and over that he held the most important position of authority, that he was an unchallenged leader, that his authority was uncontested, unopposed, and that his orders were obeyed to the letter. Each phrase that I've just read out was repeated several times, and that this was in space of less than an hour on Monday alone. I'm not sure if counsel was attempting to manifest or conjure up some sort of evidence by repeating these assertions, but the evidence to support these lofty claims remained largely unstated in its closing, as is the case in its final brief. And we provide examples of this, Your Honours, at the current slide, that the same exaggerated claims that we heard in court are also recycled in the brief, with no supporting citations. Where there are cites, such as the case at paragraph 461 at the bottom right-hand side, the reference is uncorroborated and directs Your Honours to evidence which, by its very nature, cannot bear the load of such an exaggerated claim. For example, and again, this is just one example that I'm setting out, the allegation that the elements did not do anything without Mr. Yekatom's authorization is supported solely by P2328. Even without assessing this witness's evidence, that's quite a task for any witness to be able to prop up this huge claim, this unequivocal assertion. But it's made worse here when Your Honours recall that the witness P2328 is an individual who possesses no understanding of the operational structures of RFA CPP, given he was not part of the movement, and demonstrated by the intentional bias and inconsistent claims with regards to the organisation of the group or the movement. And this is set out in paragraphs 461 of our brief. How can a witness that unequivocally states that Mr. Yekatom's authorization was the be-all and end-all also then, in the same breath, say that actually Mr. Yekatom and the movement would have been disorganized, unstructured, and relying on handouts from local villagers? It does not quite paint the picture that the prosecution would have us believe that presents Mr. Yekatom as an all-powerful, all-encompassing commander, which oversaw a structured, automated movement in order to demonstrate and discharge its burden of proof. Again, this is not an isolated example of the prosecution's approach, nor is it one that can only be applied in relation to the alleged hierarchy of the movement. You will recall claims on Monday that Mr. Yekatom commanded through fear, and the words that were chosen by counsel were that violence, aggressions, and killings were the hallmarks of Mr. Yekatom's authority. Again, and I appreciate I may sound like I am on repeat, but what was the evidence that supports these claims? What was the evidence that supports the prosecution's attempts to malign Mr. Yekatom as a fear-mongering individual? There were no cites on Monday, and there is equal distortion in on its final brief. And I refer here to paragraph 478 of the prosecution brief, which refers to Mr. Yekatom, and I'm quoting here, as firing on P1647 for no apparent reason, safe to demonstrate his authority. no apparent reason, again, are the words chosen by the prosecution. And that's quite a choice of words when you look at the actual underlying incident that they are describing. Your Honours will recall this was the facts which underpin this incident as one where the members in question were intent on killing Mr. Yekatom, which resulted in a confrontation and which the presiding judge referred to as a duel. It is this incident, Your Honours, that P1647 was injured and the death of the two members, which the prosecution seeks to rely on in its brief to paint this picture of a commander that instilled fear amongst the RFA-CPP members. Members, of course, who were not afraid to shoot at Mr. Yekatom. Nor were the prosecution's efforts on Monday to depict Mr. Yekatom as a zealous warlord matched in any reality. The prosecution clings on to alleged titles given to Mr. Yekatom to point to his authority. And then it makes sweeping conclusions as to how such authority was exercised in reality. And it's this that I want to spend a moment on, and I want to play two videos to Your Honours to demonstrate the reality in which Mr. Yekatom interacted with the RFA-CPP and its members. And we'll play them back to back. If we can, the first video to be played is CAR OTP 2065-4512, and that's from 29 seconds to the end. 29 seconds to the end, please. And for the translators, the reference is CAR D290061186.
Non, non,
Jamais, ma capa. Oh. A forma que a gago sa apio sala ga pika ngombe wala. A francesa ga luchi ngozo. Matala na device na couvreton. So later la minute ajoko jo yor maboko later français ntu. Ala zagi wala za ba trompete ne. O a français la ga. Alors ka ga forma charger la aga tena tourner toi na devanta to sa ma tire ngombe andoti.
Un petit. Merci. Non, non. Pour la main, il vient autour de bien là. Bah, il vient dans tout le monde a bien qui
Thank you. And then to save time, I suggest that we play the second video at CAR OTP 2065-4849. And this, Your Honours, is a longer video, so I only ask that it's played from 30 seconds, from the minute 30 to 2 minutes. And the translation is CAR OTP 2118-5685 at 5688, lines 51 to 70.
Ige ina moya chungumbe hapo alaka alangana moya chungumbe ngape titene many secteur alala attacking si igo attacking many secteur mais moya danda ba moya talaka gutira danda ba moya ige tira danda do alaka alaloka alaga dochige ina le bumbi place ako you organize ba many place ako te zo many ko les français te lanzo Ça dit même base ni a comme 10 000, 100 000, et tout quand on dit base ni a cause il cuit dit.
Thank you. Thank you to the interpreters. So the first video, Your Honours, we could see an animated Wanju who was yelling at the RFA CPP members. And you could see Mr. Yekatom stood right there. You could see him stay silent, and you could see him at the end awkwardly sit down and then strike up conversation with a member next to him only once Wanjo has left. And it was something inconsequential about drinks. You will recall only yesterday, prosecution counsel argued that the evidence demonstrates that Mr. Yekatom exercised authority over all elements, including Wanjo, we just saw. We were told that this was a top-down hierarchy, with Mr. Yekatom sitting right at the top, as an all-powerful, and again this is the prosecution's words, an all-powerful and feared commander. The image that the prosecution wants you to have is one where members observe every word of Mr. Yekatom. We heard and were told that Mr. Yekatom's words were engraved in the minds of the elements, apparently, and where members would sit silently out in his presence out of fear for their lives or violent repercussions. And yet, Your Honours, there's not a single repercussion for holding such an outburst. Not a single word was uttered by Mr. Yekatom. Is this really the reality of a hierarchical warlord that the prosecution wants us to believe? The second video equally demonstrates the same. And whilst only 30 seconds were played, this is a longer 5-minute footage which captures strategical discussions being held between Mr. Yekatom and other RFA CPP members. The discussion, and it was a discussion, centred as to whether the movement should return to the bush given the lack of ammunition. Mr. Yekatom's proposals were repeatedly challenged by other members, and a back and forth was essentially held. Again, we are told by the prosecutions, Your Honours, that every decision, every directive flowed from the top, from Mr. Yekatom himself, that he dominated the will of the others, that his word was accepted and followed, without challenge and without exception. Again, this does not play out in reality. We can literally see with our own eyes that his proposals are challenged, that his words aren't necessarily listened to. It's not a case of just taking the title and then understanding that the authority that must then match. And that, we say, is symptomatic of the prosecution's case in this regard. And it brings me to the third general theme that was discussed on Monday by prosecution counsel with respect to the mens rea. And you recall that we were told, and again I'm quoting, that Mr. Yekatom, mindful of the context of hostilities against Muslims, that we, and I'm assuming talking about Your Honours, can only come to the conclusion that Mr. Yekatom must have known that the acts committed by his elements were going to occur in the ordinary course of events. Again, our arguments as to the actual structures and the chain of command and the hierarchies are set out in our brief. But what I want to focus on here, Your Honours, is that we do not contest that there is was an anti-Muslim sentiment which existed in Car and that was held amongst Car nationals. That's not what we're doing. And this, again, is all set out in our brief and was explained by Mr. Suzuki. But at the same time, one has to accept the reality that Seleka atrocities were being committed against the civilian population, including against individuals of the Muslim faith during the relevant period. ignoring such crimes in order to appear neutral or for whatever reason, skews the realities of the conflict and the evidence of the prosecution witness. We have heard prosecution witnesses, both fact and experts, defence witnesses, and former President Sama Panza has testified as a chamber witness, all of whom spoke of the violence perpetrated by the Seleka and the fact that they had gutted the security and civilian infrastructures. And we agree, this isn't a referendum, as led by prosecution counsel, on who was to blame, but this was the context. And so, Your Honours, if the prosecution's position is correct, that if Mr. Yekatom could really be held accountable for the fact that others, not him, held an anti-Muslim animus, then it would mean no entity, no authority could undertake operations in order to counter the extensive and indiscriminate atrocities committed by the Seleka. It would mean there would be no hope to restore security structures, all because of the fact that to undertake such operations, whilst others held an anti-Muslim animus at the same time, would find you individually criminally responsible under the prosecution's case. This is even in the case where the international community was paralysed from protecting the civilians and where there was no forthcoming assistance. But the ICC framework is not designed in this way, Your Honours. The court does not ascribe to the notion of guilt by association, which is what the prosecution is asking you to do. It is established on individual criminal responsibility. You have to individually find that Mr. Yekatom held that animus. This means in plain terms that Mr. Yekatom cannot be convicted for isolated criminal acts committed by prejudiced people beyond his control. He undertook proven efforts to ensure directives to target Seleka forces and at the same time protect the civilian population were specific and clear to all RFA-CPP members, and he adhered to the principle of distinction in all respects, in the operations, in the trainings, and in the disciplinary structures. When brought to his attention, as set out by Mr. Suzuki, and where he had knowledge, the evidence, as again depicted in our brief, showed that he stamped it out, as whether it was potential or real threats to the civilian population. And we see from the evidence, including CAR OTP 2065-3220, that Mr. Yekatom was adamant that the RFA-CPP's efforts to protect the civilians were distinguishable from the acts and crimes committed by the Seleka, such that he was adamant that they were not undone by any rogue members or by members of other anti-Balaka groups operating in the vicinity. He ensured this by distinguishing himself as a FACA member at all times within the RFA movement and to outsiders. More crucially, Your Honours, he repeated it to Muslims and to non-Muslims alike that he did not consider the Muslim population to be the enemy or his enemy. We have him on film saying the Muslims are his brothers. These were his words, not the words attributed to him from any other person. This was direct and repeated evidence which came out of the hundreds of hours of footage collected in this case and then attested to by witnesses. He freely worked with national, international, law enforcement and religious leaders to secure his objectives to protect the people, each of which recognised his legitimate efforts as set out by Mr. Suzuki, and each of whom continued to work with Mr. Yekatom well beyond the charged period. It is amongst these acts, Your Honours, that we submit war crimes and crimes against humanity do not follow with virtual certainty from these actions, from Mr. Yekatom's actions. They were not what he wanted, they were not what he espoused, and that he could not stop them. If crimes like those charged against Mr. Yekatom could flow with virtual certainty from conduct like this, then everything becomes virtually certain. it's back to guilt by association, Your Honours. And the prosecution's case is premised on holding Mr. Yekatom to this impossible standard. There's just no way out. And they do this because it's the only way that their case can work. And this stretch of the law, of the evidence, is seen in each of the presentations provided today. We have heard from Ms. Dimitri of the prosecution's attempt to ignore the evidence of the reality of the anti-Balaka coordination. Why? Why does the prosecution need to do this? It's because it needs to, for the policy to be met with respect to Mr. Yekatom. You heard just now from Mr. Suzuki how the role of the civilians was distorted. Again, why? Because it needs to do this to broaden the scope of the perpetrators for which Mr. Yekatom can be held accountable for. And you heard how the prosecution has set to cast Mr. Yekatom as this, again, all-encompassing violent leader in the absence of any evidence that this was a reality. And the prosecution's fallback on the mens rea under Article 30 is no different here. It wants and requests you to broaden and lower the threshold of Article 30 to such an extent because if you were to apply the reasonable standard, then a reasonable doubt exists. And that concludes my submissions today on the mens rea, Your Honours. If I can now pass the floor to Mr. Mitchell.
Thank you, Ms. Bavade.
Good afternoon, Your Honours. This is not working. I think, yeah, I can't hear myself. Hein? Pourquoi? T'entends? Sorry. I'm just going to ignore the technical issue. I'm going to conclude, Your Honours, with a very few minutes, less than 10, on count 29, and then with my concluding remarks. And I want to briefly address what I consider as the elephant in the room. P2475. This witness is glaringly absent from the prosecution's brief. The prosecution has not demonstrated the transparency required to inform Your Honours and the parties, and especially us, in a timely manner that they're withdrawing their reliance on P2475. Although this omission is clearly noticeable from the absence of 2475 from their brief, save for paragraph 808, where they merely state that they don't rely on him regarding his age. Now, yesterday they appeared to go a step further in their closing statement by saying that they won't rely on him at all. And in stark contrast, the legal representative of the alleged former child soldier, in his brief, he places significant reliance on the evidence of 2475. And he even goes as far as alleging, in paragraph 64 and 71 of his brief, that if someone comes and testifies, claims to be of a certain age, and brings a false document that the prosecution recognizes fabricated, and the defense finds the original document showing his true age, it doesn't matter. We should ignore the original document, and we should rely on the oral testimony, regardless of the fact that even the prosecution recognized its fabrication. So in other words, it doesn't matter if a witness comes, testify, lies, you uncover that lie. He testified under oath, and this should be sufficient. Imagine the message a representative of this court is sending when presenting such an argument, and the weight on the accused having to face two prosecutions, because this is what it is when you read those paragraphs. And if this approach is endorsed by the legal representative, it raises significant concerns about the handling of their field team and the potential prevalence of false identity among the 292 victims they represent. And he's asking you to ignore the victims' forms, claiming that they contain errors, they had no time. And irrespective of the debate surrounding the victims' forms, more concerning is that according to the latest registry filing, and you can see it on slide 74, the legal representative of the alleged former child soldier represent 292 participating victims. And because of the ABC procedure, we only received 7 forms, 7 victim participating forms. And the evidence before your honors demonstrates that all 7 forms are false or contain false information. And the forms appear on the slide before your honors. 7 out of 7. This is a striking ratio. And it's a disturbing indication on the remaining 292 clients he represents, for which we do not have access to their victims' forms. And more disturbing is in his closing remarks yesterday, counsel indicated that he was proud to have been part of the Lubanga case. This is the case where until the very end, a victim's representative continued to rely on witnesses who had fabricated evidence in that case. Continued to rely on the evidence of witnesses that were disregarded by the chamber in that case. This is the standard of truth he is asking you to apply against Mr. Yekatom on count 29. And I now want to go back very briefly on how the prosecution is capitalizing on ambiguities, including on count 29. And a clear example of that is, again, the manner in which they used in their brief, under count 29, the evidence of P1339. And you can see on slide 75 that under the chapter of count 29, in the prosecution's brief, they use the evidence of 1339 to say that there was a child named Bougie Noir at Yanwara School. And they quote an extract of his evidence where he would have said that this individual, Bougie Noir, was 14, 15 years old. And they used that evidence again yesterday in their closing statement. And they completely disregarded the clarifications you obtained, Mr. President, when you confronted him with his prior recorded testimony, where he said that individual would have been 18 or 19 years old. And they also completely disregarded, and it's also on your screen, when you specifically said that there's obviously an uncertainty with regard to the age. Despite your words, they rely on 1339 to support count 29. And yesterday, they went as far as claiming that the document we submitted in relation to Bougie Noire, stating that he was 17 years old, should be disregarded by your honors because it's unreliable, according to them. They asked you, they specifically said it's unreliable, and we're asking the chamber to be reminded of the evidence demonstrating that official orders, including birth certificate, are easily and routinely falsified in car. I wish they had reminded that to themselves when they submitted the false baptism certificate of 2475 in this case. And as your honors know, it's no secret that we keep blaming the prosecution for their lack of diligence in relation to the child soldier charge in this case. And our explanation for the prosecution's inaction and silence is that they also wanted a conviction at all cost on count 29. And we believe that this transpires from the disparity in their dedication and the resources they put in their investigation in relation to alleged interference after P 1847 testified, when you compare it to the lack of resources and dedication they put for Article 70 offenses in relation to count 29. When it serves their purpose, they will deploy time and resources. After 1847 testified, they secretly went and recorded him. They obtained private Facebook messages. They collected CDR against some of Mr. Ngai-Sona's team members. When we wanted private Facebook messages, they objected. When we wanted VWS to conduct a simple search, keyword search, in phones of individuals who were implicated in the fabrication, they objected. But when they wanted something from VWS, such as the sources of a certain newspaper article in relation to a witness from Mr. Ngai-Sona, they filed a motion. Why? Because they wanted to be able to tell you yesterday that you can convict on count 29 because none of the remaining witnesses is implicated in the fabrication of evidence. They completely forget that 1974 and 2018 are surrounded by fabrication of evidence. There are audio Facebook messages where they appear to be preparing an upcoming witness who was finally withdrawn for his testimony, where they're asking money to beneficiaries. They also forget that these two witnesses are closely related and collaborated with 2580 and 2638. They also rely on 2475, who's a family member of P1974. And that P1974 told you how he was recruited in Pisa, which is not the evidence of P2475. They asked you yesterday to convict on count 29, telling you that the remaining of the witnesses is not implicated. They have the audacity not to dedicate time and resources to investigate on Article 70 offenses in relation to count 29, and they dedicate an entire chapter of their brief relying primarily on the evidence of 1974 and 2018. So I urge your honors not to be misled by their action and to scrutinize the integrity of their evidence and the approach they took in this case. Counsel van der Pooij concluded his presentation yesterday by emphasizing the profound suffering endured by the numerous victims in Central Africa in 2013-2014. We agree entirely. He urged you to deliver justice, and we echo that call. But justice demands the meticulous examination and the accurate citation of the evidence. Justice requires acknowledging when a charge is not supported by credible evidence. Justice requires not waiting until the 11th hour to withdraw its reliance on a key witness whose evidence was fabricated. And justice also entails resisting the temptation to blame Mr. Yekatom for the commissions of crimes for which he's not culpable of, purely to meet the demands of victims. True justice is impartial. It's grounded in facts and unwavering in its commitment to fairness. And this is why, because of the brief we presented, the evidence you heard, we're asking you to acquit Mr. Yekatom on all charges. This concludes the Yekatom defense presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Dimitri. This concludes also the hearing of today. Tomorrow we continue with the presentation by the defense of Mr. Ngai.
All rise, veuillez vous lever.